Hi there, this is Steve Yedlin. Welcome to part 2 of my resolution demo. If you haven't seen part 1, I hope you'll go back and watch that one first. In part 2, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the technical details behind some of the broader concepts that were in part 1. And the first thing I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about is why it is that the second part is mastered at HD size and not mastered in 4K like part 1 of the demo was. There are a couple reasons for that. The first one is very simply that more people will be able to watch it as intended without it being resized for their screen. But there's a much more important reason, and that's that it's actually going to allow us to look more rigorously and more exactingly at professionally mastered 4K images than we would be able to if it was actually mastered in 4K. Now, that might be a little counterintuitive, but that's why I want to take a couple minutes to explain it. And it has to do with the difference between preparing a 4K image for 2K by resizing or sampling to fit and preparing it using 1:1 pixels or crop to fit. Now, the most likely way that we usually think of showing a 4K image in a 2K or HD type size is resizing or sampling to fit. Now, we are going to do that at times in this demo, but if that's all we were doing, then it would not be a more rigorous way to look at the images. And the reason is that resizing or resampling to fit means we want to take the entire expanse of the 4K image and fit it into a 2K image. Now, the only way to do that is to resample every little bit of the image into new pixels. So over here we have, this is just a schematic diagram. This is not what's literally happening, because if it was literal, each one of these pixels would just be a solid block of color and wouldn't have any detail in it. But schematically, this is what's happening, which is each little area of the frame has to be resampled into a different number of pixels using a scaling algorithm. So in this hypothetical example, the eye, instead of being made out of 4 pixels, is made out of 1. So each little area in the screen has to be resampled. So if we were resizing to fit, that would indeed be a less rigorous way to look at a 4K image than just looking at the original 4K, because every little bit of the screen has gone through a scaling algorithm, so the original image structure has been changed and it's coarser. But in a lot of this demo, we're not going to resize or sample to fit. We are going to go 1:1 pixels or crop to fit. Now, what that means is within this 4K image, there is an area that is 2K or HD size pixels across. And what we're going to do is extract that and fill the frame with it. So when we go 1:1 pixels on a 4K mastered image, we take a fully professionally mastered 4K image. We do not change the image structure at all. We take all those true 4K pixels exactly as they were mastered, and we fit each one of them onto one of your HD screen pixels. So the 2K or HD becomes an extraction of the 4K. So what you've got is a virtual 4K screen, except the image is twice as big across or 4 times as big in area measurement. And some of it doesn't fit on your screen. It's cropped so you can't see it. It's off your screen. But the part you can see is a virtual 4K screen with true 4K mastered pixels. And you're looking at it twice as big as whatever comfortable distance you chose to view this from. So just to give you a solid feeling for that, here is a 4K mastered image. It's 3840 across, as you can see right here, which is the UHD 4K size. There are a few different 4K sizes. That's just one of them. So this image right now is resampled to fit on the screen. But when I do that, now it's 1:1 pixels. So each one of the 4K pixels is 1 pixel on your screen, and you're looking at it twice as big in linear measurement or 4 times as big in area measurement as you've chosen to sit comfortably from your screen. So you can see why this would be a more rigorous way to view the image, because we're looking at true 4K pixels and you're looking at it twice as big as you normally would. So with that preamble out of the way, the first thing I'd like to look at is the perceptual relevance of true resolution. And I'm going to use the term spatial fidelity in this demo to talk about true resolution, because one of the points in the demo here is that the word resolution has some various associations and means different things at different times. So I'm going to use the term spatial fidelity to mean rigorous true resolution as opposed to just pixel count or apparent resolution. Now, in part 1 of the demo, I mentioned that I tried to control variables as much as possible so that as we were comparing the different images, we would only look at the differences in pixel count. I did that as well as was possible, but it wasn't possible to do it perfectly because there were other differences between the images. Because we used different cameras, that means we had different lens models. There were different performances by the actor and in the camera operating. We had light shifting because we had real sunlight and available light. So things just were not the same, and the cameras just simply had other differences besides pixel count, such as noise and so forth. So what we're going to do here is now we're going to really control variables and only look at the difference in pixel count and nothing else. And the way I'm going to do that, I have here on my drive original 6K image from the Alexa 65. You can see here I have the source image. It's 6560 across. And I'm going to prepare that image for 4K two different ways. And the one way I'm going to prepare it is to directly scale it from its 6K to 4K using one of the scaling algorithms I just mentioned a few moments ago. And the other way that I'm going to prepare it for 4K is to choke it down until it doesn't have any more information than 2K and then scale it up to 4K. So what we'll have is a 4K image, the exact same frame, so nothing else is different. The noise structure, the optical aberration, everything is exactly the same. It's the same frame of captured image, except we're going to compare a 6K oversampling source for 4K to a 2K undersampling. So in the literal sense, we're going to compare a well oversampled to a well undersampled source for 4K. So here we go. That's a 6K source. There's a 2K source. 6K, 2K. We're looking at this 1-to-1 pixels in true 4K. So again, this is a true 4K prepared image. We're going 1-to-1 pixels, and we're comparing a 6K source oversampled for the 4K to a 2K source. 6K, 2K, 6K, 2K. Now this is kind of the entire point of part one of the demo, which is there's almost no or perhaps no perceptual difference for the audience at the size that we actually view this for cinema. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a real difference. I'm not saying resolution isn't real, because if we go way in, we can see there's a 6K source for 4K, there's a 2K source for 4K. So again, professionally mastered 4K image using two different sources for the master. 6K source, 2K source. So we see resolution is real. Of course it's real. We're choking this thing down to a third of its original resolution and then scaling it back up. But in terms of the audience's perception, we can see there's very little, if any, effect. 6K, 2K. And remember, you're viewing this in the true 4K master image structure and twice as large as is comfortable. You're basically looking at a virtual screen that's twice the width and twice the height of your actual screen. Now, I'm going to take it a step further and make another comparison. Again, 4K pixels 1-to-1, 6K source, 2K, 6K, 2K. Now, in some ways, the perception of clarity and sharpness is actually increasing when the true resolution is decreasing. 6K, 2K. And this was one of the points in part one of the demo, which was that once we have enough resolution, there are other things that come into play for perceptual sharpness and clarity. And in this case, what we're looking at is scaling algorithms. I mentioned a few minutes ago that when you resize an image, it has to go through some sort of a scaling algorithm, an interpolation that resamples each little bit of the screen into a new number of pixels. And in this case, we're just choosing to use a different one. So over here, I was using one scaling algorithm, 6K, 2K, 6K, 2K. And over here, I'm using a slightly different one, 6K, 2K, 6K, 2K. And we can see that the result is some of what we consider to be perceptual sharpness and clarity is actually just the scaling algorithm. It's not tied to resolution, because we can see that in the very true sense, 6K, 2K, the 2K one is less resolute, but in some senses, 6K, 2K, it actually looks sharper or crisper. Advertising may have conditioned us to associate the word resolution with an expectation of perceived sharpness and clarity, but we see that such a correlation is not supported by the facts. Now moving on, I'd like to investigate how it is that we arrived at this cultural belief that ever-increasing numbers of K is going to make the audience's experience of perception and clarity ever-increasing. Because from what we just saw, that doesn't exactly follow. But let's look historically. Instead of comparing a 6K source to a 2K source, I'm now going to compare a 6K source to a standard def source. So again, we're going to make a 4K master, professionally scaled, but we're going to compare 6K source to a standard def source. So 6K, standard def, 6K, standard def. Now we can see why, when the standard was standard def, not HD, at that time counting pixels would have been exciting. Increasing pixels would have had a difference because there simply were not enough pixels. The illusion of infinite detail was broken by the fact that the pixels were simply too coarse. We weren't representing the world in small enough increments to where the size and coarseness of the pixels wasn't affecting our view. Because standard def was approximately 346,000 pixels, and we went to HD, we went to 2.2 million pixels. That's a 630% increase. Now, it seems to me obvious that at some point pixels have to be small enough that they're either completely invisible or invisible for all practical purposes. Because obviously, for example, if they were the size of single molecules or single atoms or quarks, we would not be able to see them, and shrinking them smaller would not do anything. So there's got to be a limit. And when we went from SD to HD, we actually hit that limit for most practical applications for cinema viewing. So it made sense that if the pixels were so coarse that their coarseness was visible, once the visibility goes to 0, what are the TV manufacturers selling us with the next upgrade? Because there's no such thing as negative visibility. So again, we're looking at a 4K master here, 1-to-1 pixels, so you're viewing it twice as big as you ever would. And there's a 6K source, standard def source, 2K source. Moving on, I'd like to make this even a little more visceral and show what size a pixel is in the screen, just to get a sense of what the TV manufacturers that want to upsell us are trying to, when they say we need the pixels to be even smaller, I just want to show you how small they actually already are. So if we go in, until the illusion of smoothness in the image is broken and we can see all the individual pixels, now I'm going to draw a box around 4 pixels by darkening the 12 pixels around the 4. So I'm just picking out 4 pixels at random and drawing a box around them by darkening 12 pixels. And now I'm going to zoom out. Well, that's 1-to-1 pixels. Now the box is right there. That's a box of 16 pixels with a darkening. I can turn it on and off. There it is, off, on. Now, I can barely make out this box of 16 pixels, but if the manufacturers want us to believe that we absolutely must have 4K instead of 2K, then that logic demands that these 4 pixels not look like that, but they look like that. Just those 4. We could barely see the 16 pixels. Those 4 pixels can't look like that. They have to look like that. Because remember, the difference between 2K and 4K is intensive, not extensive, meaning all the differences are single pixel size or smaller. Because what's happening on the large scale doesn't change. It's only what's happening within pixels. So to say we need 4K over 2K is saying we can't have this pixel clump like this. It has to be subdivided into 4 pixels that all average to that color. The only change is within the bounds of each pixel. So again, to look at that, here it is, 1-to-1 pixels 4K. And I'm actually going to do what we just did and clump those 4 pixels into 1. Now they're clumped. Now they're unclumped. Now you can say, Steve, that's absurd. You need to do it to the whole image, and you can't do it just in a smooth area of the frame. You have to do it at high contrast edges and so forth. Now that is what we just did, though, when I was showing you the difference between the 6K source and the 2K source. We were clumping the whole image together, but let's just do it again. Now instead of just clumping those 4 pixels, I'm going to clump all the pixels in the whole image. That's 4K, that's 2K, 4K, 2K. Okay, and let's just take a look at that on another image that has some more high contrast edges and fine detail in it. Now if we go in here, can do the same thing. I'm going to draw a box, drawing this box around these 4 pixels. So again, we can see that at 4K, this sharp line, which is actually well defined when you look at the whole image, here's the whole image. There's the whole image. These blinds are very well defined by our 6K Alexa 65, but of course when you go in, we can see that there's not some hard edge where one pixel is black and the next pixel is white. We see that there's a gradient here. Even at 4K, if we go to the camera original 6K, the gradient's made out of even more pixels, but even at 4K it's a gradient, not a 1 pixel line. And again, if we believe that we need 4K over 2K, we're saying this gradient that already looks like a sharp line can't be clumped into the average of the 4 pixels. We can't have these 4 pixels just be the average of the 4. But let's see what that looks like when we zoom all the way out. Here we go. I'm going to average those 4 pixels together. There they're averaged. There they're not. And to draw the box again, you can see the box. You can barely see the whole 16 pixel box right there. And you're viewing this at 4 times normal size at true 1-to-1 pixels. That's a 16 pixel box right there. At 1-to-1 pixels, that's how big it is. I'm going to turn the box on and off, on, off, on. You can barely see 16 pixels. And there's those couple of pixels being clumped together. And then, of course, let's do it to the whole screen. There's the whole screen clumped. 4K, 2K. So we see that pixels are moving to the size where they're small enough that they're not affecting our perception anymore, because we can see how small they are in the frame, and we know that the demand for a higher resolution means subdividing them, because all of the differences in an image's structure when it goes from 2K to 4K happen within each 2K pixel. It's intensive, not extensive. It means each single pixel needs to be subdivided even smaller into a few pixels that average to the same color as the one larger pixel. Now moving on, let's take a look again at the tenets from part 1 of the demo. Now in part 2 of the demo, so far we've only been looking at numbers 2 and 3. Fussing about spatial fidelity is misplaced effort anyway, because it's only relevant for the perceptual cinema experience up to a minimum threshold that we've well surpassed, which we saw because when we went from standard def to HD or 2K, it was a huge difference because we actually achieved practical invisibility of the pixel size, and going beyond that has very little effect. And then number 3, with that threshold exceeded, some of the chief players in perceptual clarity are not related to camera fidelity and are defined or redefined in the post pipeline. And we've already seen that a little bit because which scaling algorithm I used had more of a visual impact on the perception of clarity for the audience than did the actual resolution. But what we haven't talked about yet in part 2 here is number 1. Comparing sheer pixel counts is a misleading way to try to quantify spatial resolution. What I mean by that is that there's quite an ingrained cultural belief that we can understand the true resolving power, the true spatial fidelity of an image just by knowing the number of Ks or megapixels. But let's have a look at that and see how that actually holds up. Now I'm going to take this image here and I'm going to go in on a tiny detail of it, just his eye, which remember is us looking under a microscope for forensic clues in a way that an audience never can. So this isn't even relevant to the audience's perception, but let's just do it for our own understanding. That's the Alexa. We've gone in. So here's the Alexa XT. There's the Sony F55. There's 35mm film. There's the Red Weapon, Alexa 65, and IMAX 15 perf 65mm film scanned at 11K. Now we begin to see that the number of Ks is in no way a good measure of the spatial fidelity of the camera. Because, for example, here's the Alexa XT, which is about 3K, and there's 35mm film, which is 6K. And we've zoomed way in here on the original 6K scan, not the downsized 4K master. Now, firstly, if you look at the fine edge detail, it's about the same between the Alexa and this 6K scan of 35mm film. If anything, it might be the fine edge definition might actually be slightly better on the Alexa. It's about the same or better, and we have less noise. The 35 millimeter film has much more grain or noise, and if we're talking about true spatial fidelity and not just nominal pixel count, grain and noise is a degradation, because spatial fidelity means we have to have photometric data about the scene in ever tinier areas. But mucking up the data with noise means we didn't actually record data that precise. For increased resolution, we actually need to know real scene data in an ever smaller area. We need actual real data about what was in front of the camera to be in smaller increments, not random noise to be in smaller increments. So we can see that here K's is not a good measure of true spatial fidelity, because we're getting more true spatial fidelity from a 3K source than from a 6K source. To look at a few other cameras, here's a Sony f55, which certainly does have slightly finer edge detail than the Alexa, but not what we would expect from the numbers, at least as we've been pre-programmed to think about these numbers, 4K compared to 3K. We also see that the Sony f55 has a different character of noise than the Alexa. Moving on, here's the Red Weapon. Now, the Red Weapon may have either less or the same noise as the Alexa in terms of amplitude, but we can see that it also has much more sporadic, non-uniform noise. We also see that it's questionable as to whether this 6K camera has finer edge definition than our 3K camera. Moving on, here's the Alexa 65. Now we're actually seeing much more edge definition and finer noise. Of course, it doesn't have zero noise. No camera has no noise, but we can see that the noise is finer. So again, if we compare that to Alexa, now we're seeing a much bigger difference. Now here's IMAX 15 perf scanned at 11K, which certainly has more finer edge detail and less noise than the Alexa XT, but not than the Alexa 65. Even though this is nominally 11K. We can see it has slightly less fine edge detail and certainly more noise than the Alexa 65. Earlier in the demo, we were saying that true spatial fidelity at some point doesn't even matter anymore, but even if you are worried about it, the number of Ks is really not a good way to measure it, because we see the camera with the most spatial fidelity out of these 6 and the camera with the least spatial fidelity are both 6K. They both have numbers in the middle. We have cameras here from 3K to 11K, and the one with the lowest spatial fidelity is 6K, and the one with the most spatial fidelity is 6K. So we see very clearly that counting Ks or megapixels is not a good measure of which imaging system has the most spatial fidelity. Now, really quickly, I just want to do the same thing again on another image. Just the same thing we just did, but a lot of times you hear people talk about high resolution for wide shots. So let's just look at it quickly on this image. So I'm going to zoom, I'm going to go way in on this tiny area right here. Okay, so there's the Alexa, Sony f55, 35 millimeter film, Red Weapon 6K, Alexa 65, and IMAX. And again, in this comparison, all of the cameras have been enlarged directly from the camera original, not from the 4K remaster. So in the case of the IMAX, we're going directly from the 11K film scan. So again, we see that the number of Ks is not the best measure of true spatial resolution, because what we just looked at in the other shot holds exactly, what we looked at in the portrait shot holds exactly for a wide shot. Now, I'm not disparaging any of these cameras. We've already seen that they're all great and they all get more than enough true spatial fidelity for the audience's perception. I'm only saying that if you do want to fuss about spatial fidelity for some reason, counting Ks is not a good way to quantify it. Moving on, we've now seen both conceptually and viscerally why it was that I was saying that once you have enough resolution, then making tiny pixels even smaller is going to have less of an effect on the audience's perceptual experience of sharpness and clarity than some other attributes. And I now like to look at what some of those attributes are. We've already looked at one, which was the selection of scaling algorithms, because there's various different scaling algorithms, all of which are professional, but they're just a little different from each other. And we saw that some are sharper and some are smoother, and that affects the audience's perception of clarity. But we're now going to look at a few others, starting with halation. Now, there are a few different meanings of the word halation, so I'd like to clarify what it is that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about halation from the camera lens or the projector lens, but from the format itself. And in the case of photochemical acquisition of film as opposed to digital capture, that refers to when the light passes through the emulsion and it exposes the image, but then it hits the base, bounces back again, and now it exposes the image again, but with unfocused light. And this happens at very high contrast edges, and we get this recognizable edge bleed like this, which is very often red. This is the 35 millimeter film that we're looking at here. And we can see how this can very much affect an audience's perception of clarity and sharpness in ways that aren't even hinted at by pixel count. Because this is 1-to-1 pixels for a 4K master. We can see it's highly visible. Remember, we could barely see a 16 pixel box, and yet now we can very clearly see this edge failure. So this is 1-to-1 pixels, but even at shrink to fit size or scale to fit size, we can still see it. So this has very much to do with the audience's perception of clarity and sharpness, because we can see that the 35 millimeter film has edge failure at higher contrast. The higher contrast actually causes it to fail more. Since I shot this image, I can tell you the focus plane was at this wall, so we were focused right at where these blinds are. This is, again, a 6K scan prepared for 4K, and you can see how well the camera resolves this sharp line reduces when the contrast is more, because this is the same blind as we cross over from over here to over here. This is the same exact blind, but it's much more eroded simply because outside the sun was hitting the wall over there, and over here the wall was in shade. So the fact that the same edge is of higher contrast causes the camera's ability to resolve the fine edge erode. But the audience sees fine edge detail better at high contrast areas. So the camera's resolving power fails precisely where the audience's ability to perceive it is the greatest. And this failure is not measured in the camera's pixel count. Now, you may say, Steve, but I like halation. It's beautiful. And I actually agree in many cases. There's some times when I don't like halation, but in a lot of cases I do think it looks good. But we're not just talking about aesthetics, we're talking about spatial fidelity. And that halation is certainly a reduction of spatial fidelity. Additionally, whether it's even if you like it and you want to use it, that's even partially my point too, is these are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about in authorship, because these are things that the audience can actually see. So even a positive choice to have this edge erosion is the type of authorship decision we can make that's going to have a bigger impact than simply picking a number of Ks or megapixels that's not going to affect the audience's perception very much. Now we can see this is the 35 millimeter film. We can see that digital cameras also have some type of similar halation where there's presumably light bouncing around inside of the sensor. It's either bouncing between the photo sites or overflowing. For example, we can see that there's this magenta edge here. This is the Alexa, by the way. We can see that like the film, at the high contrast edge, it has a little more erosion, but not as much as the film. And another example, though, of the ability to author our images and think about these other attributes other than just pixel count is using an algorithm, because in part one of the demo, where I just wanted to look at pixel count and not halation, and I was trying to make the cameras equal in that sense, I had used my own personal halation algorithm, which is here. This is how I had it set in part one of the demo. We haven't been looking at it in part two of the demo. I set it kind of somewhere in between the 35 millimeter and the IMAX to make it fair. Now, if you don't like my personal halation algorithm, you don't have to use it, or you can use your own, but it's an option. You can have it on or off. And this is another example of how we can author the audience's experience of sharpness and clarity in ways that have nothing to do with pixel count. So that's my halation on the Alexa. Let's turn it off. And let's just look at some of the natural halation on some of the other cameras. So this is the Sony f55, which we can see has much finer halation than the 35 millimeter film, but it's much more extreme in both the color and the intensity. So it's finer, it doesn't erode as much of the image, but it's much more intense. Coming back to the film again, we can see that even in this 4K master, this erosion is probably about 15, 16 pixel radius, which means a 30 pixel diameter or so. So the fact that the clarity of edges is eroded by 30 pixels shows that it's sort of absurd to imagine that we need even more pixels, because if we think we need even more resolution, we're saying we need to subdivide these single pixels into more, but we already have fidelity erosion at a 30 pixel width. So making changes that are smaller than a single pixel won't do anything if we already have fidelity erosion that's 30 pixels across. Moving on, this is the red, which we can see is slightly similar to the Sony in that it has less radius of erosion than the film, but it's much more extreme in color. Here's the Alexa 65, which is the only camera that almost has no visible halation of that sort, but even with the Alexa 65, we can see that it erodes a little bit at the higher contrast because we get a sharper, cleaner line here, and at the higher contrast it erodes, but much less than any of the other cameras, and also it's not tinted like all the other cameras. Here's the IMAX, which, of course, since it's the same film stock as the 35 millimeter, is exactly the same thing except with a smaller radius. Now that's halation, but I want to just take a minute and discuss how some of these decisions about how we author the image for the audience's experience of sharpness and clarity also affect other aspects of the audience's perception. You know, for example, let's say this was a green screen shot and the outside there was actually composited with the inside. If we select a camera model that has halation built into the camera, either because we like halation and we think the only way to get it is from the camera, or because we're only evaluating a camera's true resolution based on pixel count and not based on halation, we may end up with edges that are more eroded, which is going to make the composite harder to do correctly. And not only that, after the composite comes together, if we try to put halation on the background, we have a problem because the foreground already has halation and the background doesn't. Whereas if we shoot with a cleaner camera, then do the composite, and then put halation on the foreground and background together, we're getting exactly what would happen with a real photographed image, which is the foreground and the background receive the halation together. So that could actually make it look more organic. The same goes for grain. We're going to talk about grain in just a moment, but the same is true for grain in that if we composite two images together and then they receive the grain together, that's going to make the foreground and the background sit together more naturally than if one has one kind of grain and the other has the other kind of grain. And of course, with both grain and halation, they affect things like in color correction. If we try to do a secondary color correction, we might start to agitate the grain. Whereas if we color correct first with our secondary and then add the grain afterwards, rather than having the grain built in, we can avoid that type of agitation. And speaking of grain, let's move on to the grain section. We already looked earlier, these different cameras have different amounts of grain and noise, which affects the true spatial fidelity because it's a lack of information of color detail in fine areas, but it also affects our perception of sharpness and clarity. To take an example of that, let's just get a different shot here. For example, here's the Alexa. And in part one of the demo, again, because I was trying to look at mostly differences of pixel count and not other things like grain and noise, I was trying to equalize the cameras, and I had used my own personal grain algorithm on the Alexa, which looks like that. So that's it: off, on, off, on. Now, you may not agree with this, but I personally actually find the image to look sharper and clearer with the grain algorithm on than with it off, on. Now, you may not agree, but certainly something to reckon with your audience's perception, because I've shown these comparisons to people where the grain is not on the Alexa, and if I show the Alexa next to, the 35 without the grain on, people are likely to think that the 35 is more resolute, which they don't think when the grain is on. So even though in the literal sense it's a degradation, it can perceptually appear to be an increase. Now, I'm not exactly sure why. I have a couple of theories about it. One is very simply that when you have a smooth area like a wall, let's look at the same thing on the Alexa 65. There's the Alexa 65. There's the grain on, off. When you have a smooth area like a wall, there's nothing for your eye to focus on because it's just a smooth field. Whereas if the grain is on, your eye has something to grip onto and it looks like there's detail there. Another reason, again, I'm just speculating, but another reason that grain may cause the appearance of sharpness is just that it looks like there's a whole world going on in there. It almost looks like if you zoom in, you would find all kinds of more information in there, when in fact it's really just some teeming noise. But again, the fact that added grain can actually look like more resolution tells us two things. One, that the audience's perception of clarity and sharpness is, of course, not tied to true resolution, since in this case we can actually increase their perception of clarity and sharpness by reducing true resolution. And secondly, it shows that how we decide about our grain is part of the authorship of our image and affects the audience's perception. For example, you can use an extremely low noise capture system like the Alexa 65 and then choose which type of grain you want to add. For example, this is my own personal grain algorithm, which I like, but if you don't like it, you could use a different one or none at all. For example, this is the Red camera 6K without the grain algorithm on it, and we can see that its noise is a little more electronic than the Alexas or films, because there's the Alexa, which looks a little more like regular grit, and there's the Weapon, which looks a little more electronic. Now, you can't truly get rid of the original noise, even if you use noise reduction. That's just covering it up. Noise is a lack of information. You can't restore the information that you never got. You can cover it over by putting my grain algorithm on top of it. But if you don't like the type of noise, then that's another aspect of the authorship, selecting the type of noise, whether it's built into the camera or whether you're adding it afterwards. Another thing that affects the audience's experience of sharpness and clarity is sharpening. Sharpening is adding contrast at edges. In part one of the demo, I had added a very, very slight amount to the Alexa footage, which we haven't been looking at here in part two, but I'm going to turn on now. It's just that little bit. So that's on, off, on, off. And it's ever so subtle, on, off. But this is an example, again, of how we can finesse the audience's experience of sharpness and clarity in how we author our images. Now, of course, if we add a whole lot of sharpening, it's just going to look artificial. But just a little bit is just another trick in our bag of tools. And as you can see, it's enough of a difference that it could be larger than the difference between two true resolutions. Since we saw earlier that we could barely make out the difference between a 6K source and a 2K source for the same 4K master. Now, sharpening, which we were just looking at, is contrast at edges. But even just overall contrast, which has nothing to do with true spatial fidelity at all, it's just a color correction, can affect our perception of sharpness and clarity. Because here's the image as we saw it in the demo, and there's a different color correction. These are just color corrections. There's no sharpening, there's no change in true resolution, and yet it seems to pop and to see more details when it's more contrasty. So even something that has absolutely nothing to do with not only with true resolution, but it's not even anything spatial, it's an overall color correction, can affect the audience's perception of sharpness and clarity. Next, let's take a look at compression. Now, there are many different types and amounts of compression. So just to give an example, I've selected an amount that's similar to both the type of 4K that comes into consumer homes for viewing and also that some of the 4K DSLRs use. So we're going to compare the 6K mastered image directly to a 4K master, but then we're going to compare that uncompressed to compressed. So here's uncompressed, compressed, uncompressed, compressed. Now that's much more of a difference than we were seeing from using a 2K as a source for the 4K master. There's a 2K source for the 4K master, 6K source, 2K, 6K source, and then 6K source compressed. Still a 4K master, though. We're still mastered in 4K directly from the 6K, but we're compressed. And yet, on both the professional and consumer side, this can be a very real issue. Because on the professional side, as I mentioned in part one, we have very real examples of filmmakers, studios, and so forth making decisions based on just a number of K and ignoring the compression and not testing how the compression is going to affect their final image. And not only that, but we also have the same problem on the consumer side because, for example, not only here's the compressed version, not only do we have this kind of overall lack of edge definition that comes just from compression and not from change in pixel count, but we get this banding here, which you can see there's huge swaths of the image that start to get clumped together. These are much, much larger than single pixel size. The idea that we have to increase resolution inside the bounds of each pixel when the actual failure is many pixels wide is a fallacy. Because resolution says each pixel is very fine, but it's not fine enough. We need to subdivide it. And yet we have problems that are much, much larger than a single pixel that we wouldn't have. For example, there's 2K source for 4K. Now we don't have that problem. The compression's creating the problem. So that's a 6K source for 4K. That's a 2K source for 4K. But the compression is making this problem. And as we've kind of culturally programmed ourselves to believe that whenever we see chunks and clusters, it means we need more resolution, we could actually be in a downward spiral where consumers are getting a compressed image because the resolution is high. And when people watch things at home, the fact that the resolution goes up doesn't mean their bandwidth goes up. So their image may need to be compressed more, whether it's coming over digital cable or out of some kind of digital disk or a downloaded file. They're going to have a limited bandwidth. And if the bandwidth or throughput doesn't go up, when the resolution goes up, the compression increases. And we could end up with a downward spiral where if consumers see these chunks which are caused by compression, but they think it's resolution, they say, I want more resolution. Well, then providers increase the resolution, but they have to compress it even more. It gets worse and worse. And we could actually end up with a downward spiral. Moving on, there's also optical aberration. It's beyond the scope of this demo for me to start looking at a bunch of images shot on different lens types and doing any controlled tests of lenses. But suffice it to say that we hear a lot these days about DPs and directors wanting to shoot on either vintage lenses or lenses that have some sort of special character. And obviously, by definition, the difference between these lenses and a technically clean lens is a degradation of spatial fidelity. Now, the fact that that degradation is visible, or at least they believe it's visible, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it, means that this could be a larger brush in our palette than pixel count for affecting the audience's perception of clarity and sharpness. If the audience can't see a clarity difference between two different pixel counts, but they can see one between two lens types, why do we advertise shot in 4K over advertising shot on a technically good lens model? Of course, optical degradation can be beautiful. I'm only pointing out that if we are selling the audience on clarity, then lens selection and even f-stop can play a larger role in the audience's experience than pixel count. Moving on, another thing we can use to author our image is just the order that we do the other attributes in, because it's not negligible how we decide what order we're going to do things in. One example is sharpness and grain. If I first sharpen and then add the grain algorithm, I have the advantage that I'm only sharpening the underlying image and not the grain. So we can see here in the order of calculations, first sharpness, then grain. Whereas with the 35 millimeter film, the grain is already baked into the image, so we can't have the sharpening before the grain. Now, if we were to sharpen the 35 millimeter the same amount that I sharpened the Alexa, which I didn't do in the demo, but if we were to do, we would also be sharpening the grain, which looks like that. Now, unlike the Alexa, the effect is almost like we're only sharpening the grain and not the image. Off, on, off, on. So the order that these calculations happen in is very important to the final result. Another example of that is in our scaling algorithms. Now, many times our images go through several color space transformations. For example, we often shoot in logarithmic type densities, we master in gamma encoded, and we do visual effects in linear. Now, as we're going through these different transformations, if we do our scaling algorithms to resize the image at the wrong time, we can get unwanted artifacts. And the example here is if we were to scale this image from the 6K source to the 4K master in linear instead of in log or in gamma encoded, we would get aliasing like this right here. So this is literally the same resize algorithm, but applied while the image is in linear. So if we were to apply it during a visual effect and at the wrong time in the computation stack, we could get issues like that. So we can see how there could be perceptually relevant changes to the audience that are much larger than the true resolution, even from just the order of the calculations Okay, so moving on, next thing I'd like to bring up is the fact that everything we view is scaled. Whether we're scaling up, like from 2K to 4K, or scaling down from 6K to 4K, when we scale or resize or resample or whatever you want to call it, we're taking each little area of the image and subdividing it into a different number of pixels. So it has to go through a scaling algorithm that does this, that reallocates the image into different little tiles, which means that we don't have the original pixels anymore. So for example, let's say we shoot at 6K and we're mastering at 4K. We're going to have to resize not only from our camera original to our master size, which is some 4K, but also to all of our distribution sizes. So for example, this 4K will have to go to a different 4K because 3996 is the DCP 4K size, whereas 3840 is the UHD consumer 4K size. And it'll also, of course, have to go to the various 2K sizes because there's 2K digital cinema, which is 1998, and 2K consumer HD, which is 1920. So it's going to have to be resized multiple times. Even if you shoot at 4K and master at 4K, it almost never happens that your shooting size and your mastering size are the exact same size. You may have to go from 4096 to 3996 or any number of combinations. And it doesn't matter whether you're scaling up a lot or down a lot or doing a very tiny resize, like from one 4K size to another. Every time you scale, every single pixel in the whole image gets reinvented. So if we go in, as we go from a 6K original to a 4K master, every single pixel has to be invented. We're getting rid of all the original pixels and inventing new ones using an algorithm. So we can see that on the micro level, literally all of our original pixels are gone and we're inventing new ones. But on the macro level, when we look at the whole image, what's happening is exactly nothing. The image still looks the same. It looks just as resolute. In that example, we were going from 6K source to a 4K master, but the same is true. What if we had either a 4K source for a slightly different size 4K master, or if we had mastered at DCP size and we need to make UHD? Again, even just from 4K to 4K, that's the difference. Every single pixel is getting reinterpolated. Not a single pixel in the whole image is the same. Every pixel's been reinvented by a scaling algorithm. And on the micro level, every single thing has been reinvented, whereas on the macro level, nothing at all has changed. This is the point of scaling algorithms. Now, not only are we sizing when we master, but we're even sizing just when we go from the camera raw to the RGB file, because almost all cameras in actual use today use Bayer pattern, whereas our image files for post-production use RGB. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. It's just a little bit confusing. But in a Bayer pattern, at each position in the image, we only have one piece of information, either red or green or blue. But in RGB, for each position in the image, we have red and green and blue. So in this example, this is an example from the Alexa, but this is true. It works for all cameras. So for example, if we have a 2880 by 2160 raw image and we de-Bayer it to what they call full size, we end up with a 2880 by 2160 RGB image. But those are not the same number of pieces of data because Bayer pattern 2880 by 2160, there's 6.2 million pieces of pixel data, but in an RGB image of 2880 by 2160, there's 6.2 million times 3 because there's 3 channels in each pixel. So we need to scale the 3 channels to a new size. Unlike a regular per channel scaling, they're not scaled the same amount. And also we use a completely different type of algorithm called a demosaic algorithm. It's a different algorithm that works differently, but the result is still that the image is being scaled and resized because we have to take one number of pixels and make it another number. So in almost every single case, whenever you see an image, whether it's in the cinema or at home, the image has been resized from the camera to RGB. It's almost certainly been resized to go from the camera original to the master, resized again for the submasters, and in some cases it's resized again by your device. An example would be if you watch a 720p iTunes video on a 1920 or 4K HD TV. or if you watch a full-size HD file on a tablet or phone. So the images are scaled over and over, and every single time they're scaled, all of the original pixels are gone and new ones are invented by a scaling algorithm. And the reason that I bring this up is that I think that we tend to have a mental image of how pixels work almost like poker chips. Like we captured all of these pixels and we want to hold on to every single one of them. And if we lose any of them, then we're losing some value. But this is not a very good mental model for understanding this, because in fact, we're actually throwing all of them away and reinventing them every time. And as we saw earlier, sometimes the camera with a lower pixel count has more spatial fidelity and vice versa. We certainly saw that the number of pixels or the number of photosites was not a good measure of the true spatial fidelity of an imaging system. So when you combine that knowledge with the fact that we're going to throw out the literal pixels over and over again anyway, we see why it is that a camera's K count is not a good way to determine what mastering size the camera is suitable or unsuitable to be a source for. Now, moving on, I'm going to talk about viewing angle and why it is that I say we have enough resolution for the purposes of cinema. Now, what I mean by viewing angle is the angle determined by the ratio of the screen width to our distance from the screen when we watch a movie. So it doesn't matter whether we're looking at a 20-foot screen from 20 feet away or a 20-inch screen from 20 inches away. The size of the image on our retina will be the same either way. So it's really only this angle that determines how big the image is on our eye and how much resolution we need for our purposes. So, of course, there are other applications for imaging other than cinema, but I'm not talking about spy drones or theme park rides. But just for the purposes of cinema, if we're talking about the actual angles of view, we're not moving towards looking at things bigger. And in fact, we don't usually look at them as big as we think. And I've made this little chart of some common viewing angles that I think is very telling. For example, big screen TVs, which are the format that people are most talking about increasing resolution on, like getting 4K TVs, we're even talking about 8K TVs. But we actually, at the large end, we actually look at them smaller on our retina than even the largest tablets. And they're not even approaching the medium to large cinema viewing sizes. And yet this is the object that we're talking about selling higher resolution screens to the consumers. Now you can see why it is that TVs not only haven't been that big on our retina, but aren't going to be, because, for example, a 90-inch diagonal TV, which is, I believe, around the largest TV they make these days, has a 78.5-inch horizontal. To view that at a 68-degree viewing angle, which would be where I personally tend to view images when I go to the cinema, your couch would have to be 4'10" from the TV. I've never seen a living room that's laid out like that. If you've got a 90-inch TV, which is the biggest TV on the market, it would be highly unusual to put your couch less than one couch width away from the TV. So that's why we're almost never going to be viewing big screen TVs larger on our retinas. Another telling example is that we tend to think that if we project images, we're always seeing them bigger. But just as an example, my laptop is a 15-inch MacBook Pro, which has a 13-inch horizontal. Now, a pretty comfortable viewing distance for that is 20 inches. That's around 0.7 ratio of screen width to distance, which is about 39 degrees. That's over here, so that would be, for example, larger than I personally view my own big screen TV, which would probably be more like 30 degrees. But if you double that, which is what we're doing when we go 1-to-1 pixels on 4K in this demo, then you're at 70 degrees, which is right around and slightly larger than you would view in the cinema. So if, for example, you are looking at this on a 15-inch MacBook Pro 20 inches away, which is a comfortable viewing distance, then when I go 1-to-1 pixels on a 4K master in this demo, you're looking at true 4K image structure, and you're looking at it at literally slightly larger than the size that I view things in the cinema. And I tend to sit closer than most people. When I get my first choice seats and the theater's not sold out so people can pick whatever seats they want, there are many more people behind me than in front of me. We can also see that even in the Cinerama Dome, which is an 85-foot screen, the seats that sell out first are actually still here at 68 degrees. So even though the screen's bigger, people are still not seeing it bigger on their retina. Now, I'm not saying this to disparage the feel of seeing something on a huge screen, because I think that there's certainly a visceral experience of seeing something on an enormous screen with the sound and the scale and all that. So this is not to disparage seeing movies on a huge screen, but just to say that the fact that it's on a big screen does not mean necessarily that the image is bigger on our retina or that we need more resolution. And the fact that people at the Cinerama Dome choose to sit farther than they could sit even at a regular size screen, and that at the regular size screens, people tend to sit behind where I do, and the fact that big screen TVs, which are pushing for the most resolution, are viewed the smallest, all of these things together show that we're not really pushing towards images getting bigger on our retinas, so we don't necessarily need more resolution. There's no progression historically of how big we're viewing things. Now, of course, the one exception is a specialty thing like an IMAX theater, which you can see is actually larger. That's pushing into the specialty world that I was talking about. It would also kind of be like theme park rides and other special applications. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is that we should never see component pixels. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, here is a 4K image, 1:1 pixels. So this is a 4K master from the 6K source. And I think that sometimes what people think they're going to see, if this was going to be from a standard def source instead of from a 6K source, is that they're going to see the pixels. But if you see pixels today, it's just a mistake. Somebody's done something wrong. Because the thing is, I haven't actually resized this yet from standard def. So if we look at it at 1:1 pixels, it looks like that. And of course, you still can't see the pixels because they're still the same size on your retina as they were when it was 4K. So instead of just making it standard def, let's again prepare it for 4K from a standard def source. That's going to look like that. That's a 4K master from a standard def source, 6K source, standard def. We don't have to see any component pixels. If we use a good scaling algorithm, then the image can be prepared for whatever size without seeing pixels. Of course, it still looks irresolute, but we don't see pixels. This type of lack of resolution is the same as an analog lack of resolution. Like in the old days, if I would have zoomed in on an image using an optical printer, I would never see pixels, but it would get more and more irresolute. We can do the same digitally, even to absurd degrees. This is going all the way in. This is a 12 times magnification. Sorry, that's a 12 times magnification on just his eye, and it's not necessary to see pixels. But again, I think what sometimes people think they're going to see is when they go in, they're going to see all these component pixels like this. But this is just pushing the wrong button. We can just use a different scaling algorithm that doesn't do that. And of course, it's irresolute because we've pushed in past the resolution this camera was ever meant to be used for, but we don't have to see pixels. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up, that we don't need to see pixels, is this dangerous quagmire that, like I was talking about earlier with compression, that because we've been pre-programmed to believe that if we ever see anything stair-steppy or blocky, then there's not enough resolution. But this shows that with contemporary resolutions of screens, we really shouldn't be seeing pixels, at least on photographed images. Maybe a little bit different for generated graphics, but on photographed images, we should not be seeing pixels. So if you see evidence of stair-steppiness, it really means that somebody did something wrong. They pushed the wrong button rather than the fact that we don't have enough resolution. Now, moving on, I want to talk about large screens, cropping, and special VFX applications. Now, if we look at the three tenets again, there's one of them that can have some exceptions, and that's number 2. Fussing about spatial fidelity is misplaced effort anyway because it's only relevant for the perceptual cinema experience up to a minimum threshold that we've well surpassed. Now, we've seen that's definitely true if you just simply shoot an image and then view it at any of the normal viewing angles that we could expect even from an 85-foot screen. However, there are some special applications, such as we mentioned those specialty IMAX screens. Another special application would be if we crop way in, as we had just looked at with the zooming way in on an eye or something. And another application would be special VFX applications. For example, if we're going to use a camera to shoot a plate and then later extract a small background out of it. Now, on the one hand, it is true that these three things could be rare exceptions to number 2. But a few things to remember. One is, as we've seen, we have to be doing extreme large screens cropping or visual effects applications, not incremental, before it makes a difference, because we saw that all of our cameras already surpass the threshold for resolution by more than we need for most applications. So firstly, this only becomes an exception if the change is extreme rather than incremental. But the second thing to remember that's probably more important is that 1 and 3 are still true. Comparing sheer pixel counts is a misleading way to try to quantify spatial resolution, and with the threshold exceeded, some other chief players in perceptual clarity are not related to the camera types. But number 1 is especially true. It's important to remember that even if we bump up against an exception to number 2, that number 1 is still true. If we suddenly get into a situation where for some reason we do need to start fussing about spatial fidelity beyond what's usually visible for the purposes of cinema, we still can't select which camera is best based on the megapixel or K count, as we've already seen very well. Now moving on, I want to talk about future-proofing. And the only reason I even bring this up is because sometimes when I've spoken about this topic to people, they say, what about future-proofing? And I'm not really sure what they're asking me when they say, what about it? I kind of feel like saying, well, what about it? That sounds like an emotional appeal with no content, but let's just talk about it for a moment anyway. Now, as far as future technologies go, it feels like one thing they're not working on is new human eyes. But we already saw that given how human eyes currently work, pixels are already small enough that they can't be seen. So hopefully clear thinking about this will prevent us from having even larger, unnecessarily high data rates just so that the TV manufacturers and content providers can upsell us. Because if we're not actually getting anything for it, hopefully we won't actually be upsold. But let's say in the future 8K became a standard. We've already seen we can resize any one image to any other size using a scaling algorithm, and that it's just going to look exactly the same. So the fact that it isn't, let's say, mastered in 8K for a future 8K monitor is in no way a detraction from it just looking exactly how it looks right now. So in that sense, it's perfectly future-proof. For example, we wouldn't say that Charlie Chaplin didn't future-proof his movies because they were black and white, and now TVs can show color, or projectors can show color. And in the same way, whatever the movie looks like now, it can certainly look like in the future. So, for example, right now, this is our 6K source prepared for a 4K master, but let's just go ahead and prepare it for an 8K master. Now it's 8K, and if we look at it 1-to-1 pixels, this is 1-to-1 pixels in 8K. So you're now looking at a true mastered image, proper 8K image structure on a screen 4 times as big as your screen. And that's what it looks like. It looks perfectly resolute. And then just as a comparison, right now, this is the 6K source from the Alexa 65 directly to our 8K master. But let's compare that to what if we had a 4K source? What if we'd already mastered at 4K instead of 8K, and then we wanted to up-res to 8K? The difference would be that 6K source, 4K source. You're looking at true 8K and looking at it 4 times bigger than the comfortable distance you're sitting at. 4K source, 6K source. So obviously we're fine as far as that goes. And just to point out one more thing about future-proofing is we already see that pixels are small enough that it's fine for the audience's experience of sharpness and clarity. And even if screens were to suddenly get much, much, much larger, which is unlikely because as we saw in the angle of view section, we're not even moving in that direction. But even if that suddenly did happen in the future, our current movies are mastered assuming that the audience can actually see the whole screen. So for example, when the director sets up this portrait shot, he assumes that you can see the actor's face and that this feels like an intimate portrait. He doesn't assume that the audience can mostly just see the area between his eyes and they have to swivel their head way to the left to see this eye and way to the right to see that eye. So at some point, if the screen got too big, we would actually have a failure of the storytelling before we'd even have a failure of the resolution. The next thing I'd like to talk about is display versus camera pixel amounts. Now, the dominant narrative seems to be that whatever size we're mastering for or distributing for, the camera has to have a higher pixel count than the display format. For example, if something comes out in 4K, you might hear someone say it's not real 4K if it was shot 2K and then resized to 4K. But I actually think that's a problematic way of thinking of it, and it actually makes more sense that displays have more pixels than cameras. And the reason for that is manifold. Firstly, we've already seen that a camera's pixel count is not a good measure of its true spatial fidelity or true resolution. So the idea we can know by a camera's pixel count whether or not the camera is suitable to be the source for a certain mastering size is clearly a false notion. Secondly, a camera only shoots photographed images, whereas a monitor or a projector has to display both photographed images and generated graphics. Now, generative graphics, it's possible to have much sharper fine edge detail. As we saw when we went way in on even 4K images, that things that look like sharp edges were actually gradients. However, when you have generated images, for example, this is a 1 pixel checkerboard, so that each one of these squares is exactly 1 pixel size. And this is a 4K image of a checkerboard, 1 pixel size checkerboard in 4K. Now, that's what our picture looks like. That's the checkerboard. So you can see you're never going to have on a photographed image, you're always going to have at the micro level. At the macro level, you might have sharp edges, but at the micro level, you're always going to have these soft gradients where even a sharp edge transitions over several pixels, and it's not complete black versus complete white. It's a softer contrast. And the more resolution you have with photographed images, the wider in pixel count the gradient, and the less likely you are to have a 1 pixel edge, because an edge that looks sharp at the macro level is, at the micro level, a gradient. And the higher the pixel count, the more pixels the gradient is made out of. Whereas generated graphics and text can have any arbitrary amount of fine detail. So you could think of the oversampling versus undersampling in the other direction. You could say we want monitors and projectors that are oversampled and that they can show the image with more precision than the source file has if needed, because the monitor or projector may have other things it has to show besides photographed images. That about wraps it up, but in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I think that what all of this is pointing to is that if we want to be authors instead of shoppers, and if we don't want to be manipulated by salesmanship, then we must recognize that authorship comes from nuances and complexity, not mere brand selection or K counting. Thanks for watching.